ours has a regulation, the state of Oklahoma has a regulation that says that you cannot draw.
You guys ready?
This is why they have these things. There we go.
Move a little closer.
It is noon. I know we delayed a little last time. We do have a quorum present. We'd like to start on time. So we call the meeting to order, begin with the prayer and pledge. I think the last time I chaired a meeting last week, I had your brother do this. Would you please lead us in a prayer and pledge?
You bet. Let's pray first. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this wonderful day you've given us, Lord, the opportunity to be here, Lord, and just pray for wisdom, that your Spirit would be here and just guide us. Just let us realize that we're here for our community, Lord, and just the betterment of it, Lord. Just pray that your presence would be here and just be with each one of these people, given their time. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Attention, salute, pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We can have a roll call, please, first.
Sordo,
Present.
Williams,
Present.
Durr, present. Moore, Berger,
Here.
Miller,
Here.
Dillard.
First item of business on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from the August 9th, 2021 regular meeting.
I so move. Was I the only one here?
I wasn't here.
I was the only one here.
I
Me and you.
You can still approve the minutes, whether you were here or not.
Then
I mean,
will
we don't have
second.
any. Next second.
Have a motion second to approve the minutes. Do we have any questions or discussion? If you could call the roll, please.
Williams,
Yes.
Durr, yes. Berger,
Yes.
Miller,
Yes.
Sordo.
Yes. Before we get to our presentation from Mr. Ellis, do we have any petitions from the audience? Okay. First item of business then for today is Mr. Nathan Ellis. Mr. Ellis, if you could, glad you're here today. I'm glad you could make the trip, I guess from Edmond. Are you from Edmond or
Our office is in Oklahoma City.
Oklahoma City? Okay.
I have an outline that I'll kind of generally follow, so.
And if you could introduce yourselves too and
There's additional copies here. Good afternoon. My name is Nathan Ellis. I'm with the Public Finance Law Group in Oklahoma City. And a little bit about our firm. We do public finance law all over the state, cities, counties, state, rural water districts, all governmental entities. We've worked with the city of Pryor recently as 2019 on the sales tax financing that was done. So we've served as your bond counsel, and as kind of an offshoot of the bond counsel role that we play, we also do quite a bit of economic development work, working with primarily municipalities on different projects, be it sales tax incentives to tax increment finance districts to improvement districts, just different options that are available, tools that are in the tool bag. So with that said, I've got this presentation that I've put together. Feel free to ask me questions as we go along. This is the sort of thing, I can make this a 5-minute presentation, or I can make it a 5-hour presentation. I'm not going to make it 5 hours.
I'm not going to vote for the 5 hours.
So I can kind of talk as long as you need or want me to, but so really just as Ricky asked me to come up here and give just kind of an overview of tax increment financing districts and some of the opportunities that you have to be able to use them. And so this outline is really meant, first as an overview of the process, talk about the different types of TIF districts and the different reasons why you might want to create one and how the different ones might actually look. What are some of the financial impacts associated with creating a TIF? One of the big issues is the financing of TIF districts. I mean, when you're talking about capturing tax revenues or in the future, but you've got to do projects now, how do you pay for those costs up front? And then some of the common arguments that you see against creating a TIF district. And not every TIF district is a good idea. I've had a lot of ideas that have been proposed that say, you know, you can't do a TIF district, you shouldn't do a TIF district. Maybe there's a better way to do it than, or an easier way that's more efficient that gets you to the same end result with some other economic development tools. So we really try to advise our clients on really what's the best tool to use in a particular situation. And TIF is not always the right answer, although oftentimes it is a good and effective answer. So the process itself, it's based out of Article 10, Section 6C of the state constitution. It's put in place a number of years ago. It was amended most recently as 2004. And then it's the enabling statutes are called the Local Development Act, and it's in Title 62, Section 851 and following. The process starts, I can use city and county interchangeably, but effectively the governing body or the city is going to pass a resolution of intent that says we want to consider establishing a TIF district, and it creates a statutory review committee. That review committee is comprised of all the taxing entities that are going to be affected. So depending on what type of tax you're talking about capturing within a TIF district, it might be all the ad valorem representatives, so your school, your county, health department, EMS, fire protection, library, technology center, whoever has an ad valorem tax levy would have a seat on that committee. In the event you were talking about sales tax, that would be limited to the city sales tax or the county sales tax. So in that, if you were a sales tax only TIF, you wouldn't have the school district on the committee necessarily. They wouldn't be an affected taxing entity. And so the city council appoints one of its members to be the chairman of that committee. That chairman proposes a list of 7 at-large representatives to the balance of the committee, and then the balance of the committee selects 3 to be the additional at-large members. So again, you might have a committee as small as 6 people in some circumstances, and I've seen as big as 11 or 12 people, depending on how many different ad valorem taxing jurisdictions there are out there. One of the things that intent resolution does also is it directs the preparation of a project plan. That's the primary document that's going to govern what the TIF is going to be about. So it's going to set out what's the economic development project, what are the TIF projects that need to be completed in order to make that project move forward. What are the tax revenues that are going to be captured? How long are they going to be captured? How much of the tax revenues are going to be captured? And then, you know, what are the specific project costs? How are they going to be expended? For what purpose? And so it defines all of those different parameters. That project plan is presented to the review committee, and they make a recommendation to the city council to either adopt it as it is, you know, turn it down as it is, or maybe adopt it with certain considerations or specific comments that need to be incorporated into that. Separate and apart from that, the planning commission of the city also looks at that project plan, and they also make a recommendation to the city council whether to, you know, up, down, or with certain conditions attached. Then you also have, as a third step in the process, you've got public hearings that are held. And so notice is published. You've got to give 14 days notice, publication in a paper. That first hearing is held. It's primarily a presentation of the project plan and then a question and answer session for members of the public. I typically try and schedule those, kind of coordinate them with regular meetings of the city council. It's kind of nice because then you can present that at the same time and provides good opportunity for everybody to be involved in the discussion. The second hearing is really more for just a public comment. You know, I love this, I hate this, whatever the comments might be. Once all of those items have been completed, and they don't necessarily have to be in any particular order, but once they've all been completed, Then that all goes back to the city council, and the city council makes the ultimate determination whether or not to adopt a TIF ordinance, which would actually adopt the project plan and establish the geographical boundaries of the TIF district. Beyond that, so if the city council decides to adopt in line with the recommendations and the general comments that have been made, it's a simple majority vote to adopt the ordinance. If they diverge from, if there's been a negative recommendation, or the city council decides they want to do something a little bit different from what's been approved by the other entities, then it would require supermajority of 2/3 approval in order to approve it. But ultimately, the city, under current law, does have the authority. You can have a scenario, and we try to avoid this. We try to work with all the ad valorem taxing entities, but you literally could have a scenario where all the taxing entities say, we do not want this, and the city could still move forward with it. So will that change at some point in the future with legislation? There's been a push to try and do that at various times. So far, it's not moved forward at all, but after you have that formal approval, then kind of the next phase beyond that is you're going to have some sort of economic development agreement that gets put in place with whoever might be a developer or somebody that's somehow benefiting from the implementation of the project plan. So there's basically a statutory condition that you have to have a development agreement with anybody who's going to directly benefit or be receiving some sort of incentive related to the project. Now, you can have scenarios where the city, and this kind of gets into our types of TIF districts in the next section on page 2, you have what we call developer-driven versus governmental-driven. Sometimes you'll have somebody that comes in and they have this plan for what they want to do. I mean, maybe it's a manufacturer that wants to locate here, maybe it's someone that's got this big retail concept that they want to put in, but they come in and they say, I want to do this, I can't make it work unless I get A, B, and C in the form of these types of incentives, and the TIF district might be the tool to try and put that together. And so a lot of times when you have that developer-driven, we've got maybe very specific parameters that we incorporate into the TIF district. We try and frame it so that it fits the project that's on the table. When you see more governmental ones, that might be a scenario where we've got this general area. We don't have anybody interested, but we'd like to maybe put this framework in place that provides some incentives and you see this especially with like a downtown redevelopment type project where you might put that in place and here are the things that are available, and so basically anybody in there, if you come in and do this, these are the things that are going to be available to you that might help incentivize that desired outcome. And so in that case, you might or might not have individual development agreements with some of those specific entities, but you might contemplate doing improvements to the streetscape or sidewalks or things like that, and the city might just take that on itself. Maybe we talk about how do you pay for those things. Maybe the city decides we're going to pay for those things, but then we're going to recoup those dollars down the road and reimburse ourselves as TIF revenue. So that's one of the potential financing mechanisms that we get in there. Kind of related to that, we also see a more comprehensive development plan, large area, again, downtown redevelopment area, that might be a good example of a larger area versus a targeted development where you've just got a single business or a single manufacturer, and maybe it's a specific parcel that's not being used or, is perhaps blighted. There's kind of a misnomer. Blighted property absolutely would qualify for a TIF district, but it does not have to be blighted in order to create a TIF district in any area. You have to have a couple different things. You can do it if it's designated as an enterprise zone, then that's kind of an automatic qualifier. Otherwise, then there's kind of this nebulous term of an undeveloped or underdeveloped area. So it's called a redevelopment area. And so, you look at that, okay, it's just been a decline. It's, if it's a vacant piece of land, it's always been vacant. You know, maybe it's occupied, but business is gone, it's dilapidated, it's just kind of, you know, nothing's happening. So those are the different types of areas that you see. We see retail, we see industrial, we see housing. There's kind of challenges to all of those. Industrial ones tend to be pretty straightforward. You're typically talking about ad valorem, but you bring in an industrial person, they generate this new ad valorem tax. Historically, that revenue hasn't been there. You capture some portion of that revenue for some period of time and put it into certain costs that have been identified that help make that project work. Retail, you sometimes will see ad valorem in retail, but sales tax tends to be a much larger number. I would say on average, the sales tax versus the ad valorem tax generated by any retail development tends to be 5 or more times as much sales tax as what's generated on ad valorem. So that, you know, that kind of becomes the real driver of what you can actually do or what you might be able to accomplish with that revenue stream. Housing, you know, you're probably not going to have any sales tax. We're not quite to the point yet that we can track everybody's deliveries to their house. I mean, I think the technology exists, but we haven't quite gotten there yet governmentally. The structures aren't in place. But so we don't count on any sales tax in a housing type TIF district. You would see pretty much exclusively ad valorem, but depending on the development, you know, that might or might not be a huge number. You know, if it's a multifamily, it might generate a significant amount. If it's just a single family neighborhood, you know, I mean, they can be done, but then you start getting concerns, all right, you know, that's some of the growth base of a school district. Are you really starting to tap into what their revenue source might be for growing long term and putting additional kids? And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more here. Under the Local Development Act, there's 2 different types of districts. There's an incentive district, and that's actually a tax abatement district. So an entity might locate there, and they could be exempt from ad valorem tax for a period of 5 or 6 years, depending on whether or not they're in an enterprise zone. Really have seen that very, very seldom used in Oklahoma. A tax increment district, whoever pays the property taxes, they still pay property taxes at whatever the applicable rate are, but the TIF district operates to capture those revenues for some period of time and allocate them back to the identified project costs. Revenue sources that can be included, we've talked about sales tax and ad valorem. You could capture hotel motel tax. You could have payment in lieu of tax or pilot payments that might be made. One thing that kind of comes into play a lot of times when you have industrial parks where you've got a public trust or authority that owns the property, and, you know, again, very, very commonly used. You might go out there and say, all right, we're going to build this building, and you can move in there, and we'll lease it to you for $1 a year or something like that. And then, you know, they're going to pay property tax on whatever equipment they put in there, but they're not going to pay property tax on the building as well. If you create a TIF in that area, everything that is otherwise exempt, kind of because of that reason, you've got to pay a comparable payment in lieu of tax for the duration of the TIF district. So it's something to kind of keep in mind for, you know, industrial authorities when you see that particular situation. That's something you kind of factor in. If you do create a TIF, there is going to be that requirement to make that real property tax payment or equivalent to for the duration of the TIF district. And so again, you can build that into your numbers, and when you understand that, it's, you know, it's just part of the deal. So, and so really any form of local tax revenue that might be able to be generated, you could conceivably capture. I mentioned that, you know, the city can create the TIF and they can capture their own sales tax. They can capture any of the ad valorem tax. You can only capture county sales tax if the county specifically authorizes its inclusion in the TIF district. It's happened a few times, but it doesn't happen all that often. You cannot capture state sales tax unless there's some specific statutory authorization that allows you to capture that revenue stream. There's been various pieces of legislation out there that are usually fairly targeted. There's some Leverage Act statutes that are in place that if you have a big, forgetting the word, tourism type location. So I mean, example, the project that was done a few years back at Shangri-La, that area up by Grand Lake, certain amount of investment goes in, then there's a calculation they do as long as the new sales tax that you're being generated at the state level is in excess, then there's some portion of it that could potentially be captured. So those projects tend to be few and far between, but if it ever comes up, it's a potential item out there on a really large project that might come into play, but typically we don't see that too much. So the reasons for creating a TIF district. You see the primary objectives there, and these are just kind of reciting things that you see in the statutes. So if you're trying to attract major investment, serve as a catalyst to expand and retain employment, promote economic development, try and increase the tax revenues, property values, improve economic stabilities, preserve, enhance the tax base, and then generally make possible development and economic growth, which would otherwise be difficult or impossible without the project and the apportionment of taxes from within the TIF district. So what does that mean? That's kind of the but-for test. I don't know if you've ever heard that terminology. But for the creation of the TIF, this project's not going to move forward, okay? It sounds really clean-cut when you say it like that. It's not really, okay? There are clean-cut examples. We've literally had the phone call, hey, we think we've got Walmart coming to town, and we want to put a TIF district and try and capture the revenue right around it from what's going in there. Okay, well, what's the timeline? Well, they're having their grand opening here in 2 weeks. Okay, you don't need a TIF to attract Walmart at that point. It's already happened. So that's, that gives you the idea kind of at the extreme. The other end of that is you've got an area, it looks like it should develop, but maybe there's major infrastructure improvements. I mean, it's not going to happen until you can run water and sewer and power and gas and everything else, and you have some road infrastructure to be able to handle it. But it's prime property, be great, but it's just never going to happen until that infrastructure is available. That's a common use for a TIF district, where the TIF is created, and that provides a revenue stream to help offset those infrastructure costs, whether it's a developer that puts them in, recoups those dollars over time from the revenue stream, or maybe the city goes out and does the project knowing they're going to have this future revenue stream coming in from the tax revenues, whatever the case may be. So, but that but-for test is really important, and what we use is kind of the benchmark for where we say we don't want to do our resolution of intent too early, but we don't want to do it too late either. So we want to do it at an appropriate time. A company can be entering in discussions with the city about potentially doing a project, and is a TIF feasible, and when you kind of get to that point that, okay, we think we want to move forward, but this is what we're going to need, that's about the right time to move forward with the resolution and start into the TIF process. So again, as specific projects come up, that's kind of a facts and circumstances we look at. We don't want to go too early, but we don't want to go too late. So the financial impacts of a TIF district, it can be up to 25 full fiscal years. You can capture up to 100% of the tax revenue streams that you've identified. And then the baseline revenue, whatever the historical revenue collections are off that property, remain unaffected. So in a lot of cases, you've got property that has, ag value, or maybe it's even off the tax rolls because it's city-owned or authority-owned. In that case, the baseline might be 0. But if there's some existing tax value, that gets preserved and basically cut off. That existing tax revenue continues to flow all the taxing entities, and it's the increment that's generated above that. That's what's actually captured. Now, you talk about a redevelopment project downtown or something like that, you're likely to have a baseline value that actually is a significant number. And one of the issues that you see there is, if you have existing value historically and you go in and you bulldoze half the buildings because they're dilapidated, your value may drop. And until you build that value back up above the original baseline, you don't capture any revenue until you get back above that baseline number. So again, kind of in planning purposes, that's an important thing to recognize. A TIF district does not affect the tax rates. So if you create a TIF district, it is just going to capture the revenue off of the prevailing tax rates that happen to be in place. Those can change. Sales tax, you add sales tax in, other sales tax falls off. The school goes out or the county goes out and they vote GO bonds, and they issue them, and their levy rates go up, they go down. So those revenues can fluctuate over time. The revenue is actually calculated based on the assessed value of the property, and then you apply the applicable millage levy. So it's not like a fixed, if the property generates $200 right now, it's not a fixed $200. That $200 could go up or down as those millage rates change from year to year, and they do fluctuate just a little bit every year. It doesn't forgive any obligation to pay taxes. So again, contrast to an incentive district, whoever is the property owner, whoever buys the merchandise, they're going to pay the same sales tax, they're going to pay the same property tax that the person across the street that's not in the TIF district is paying. So it doesn't change that tax rate at all, doesn't affect it. The tax revenues are essentially invested back into the project. So we talk about identifying what are the project costs. There's a broad range of what they can be. On the very public side, you can have just the pure, ran water lines and sewer lines and put public streets in there, very public infrastructure. All the way to the other side where, you build somebody a building and give it to them, or you just give them a straight sales tax incentive. As they generate it, they're getting X percent of it back long term. So it can be very public and private and really all range in between. Conceptually, public type improvements tend to be more palatable to the public than, the private incentives that some people, term as a corporate giveaway or something like that. At the end of the day, I view a lot of it's red dollars, green dollars. So if we can find ways to couch those, if we can identify the more public infrastructure projects, again, that tends to be more generally palatable in the discussion as we go on. Some of the sales tax incentives. Oh, and I get one other thing on the use of the tax revenues. This is an important question too. You vote a sales tax, okay? And the sales tax is for street improvements generally, okay? If we create a TIF that includes that sales tax, the TIF purpose intercepts that revenue before it becomes street sales tax dollars. Maybe an even easier way to view it is, a school district goes out and passes a bond to build a new high school, okay? The TIF intercepts those dollars that, again, are on the increment of value within that defined development area. It intercepts that. The purpose of that was clearly to build a new high school, right? We're capturing it. It becomes TIF dollars for the TIF purposes that have been set out in the ordinance and in the project plan. And then once that process is completed, once that purpose is satisfied, then any revenue that's remaining drops back through, and at that point in time, now it becomes for the purpose that it was voted for. It would become street tax dollars. It would become dollars to put in the building fund for the school and use for capital projects. So it's an important thing to note, and that's kind of legal, and that was one of the issues historically that there were with TIF districts in Oklahoma. It was actually decided by some litigation that finished up in about 2004, about the same time as the last constitutional amendment as well, so that set out that yes, it does capture and it's for that specific purpose of the TIF while the TIF exists. So some of the sales tax implications, obviously a city relies on sales tax primarily for its operations and various capital improvements. We talked about capturing it without that purpose. A pure sales tax rebate, if you did that, that's often, if you're just talking about sales tax, a lot of times a sales tax rebate that just comes before the council and it's a simple majority vote is a lot simpler and less involved process than a TIF district is. But you can only use sales tax dollars that have that legal purpose. If you have general purpose sales tax dollars, you could use them for a sales tax rebate. If you've got economic development sales tax, you could use that. If you've got a sales tax for water and sewer lines, you can't use that to rebate to a developer for their project. So that kind of becomes the consideration. If you've got those constraints on those sales tax dollars, you might need to use a TIF in order to free that revenue stream up for that purpose. But if you don't, if you can do it without that, again, I've told a lot of clients, should do a sales tax rebate instead of doing a TIF district, because, I mean, one, my involvement will cost you a whole lot less on that process. It's a lot less expensive, a lot shorter, and again, you just bring the development before the council, and it's a straight up or down vote. One of the big issues that you see with a TIF district or that you need to be concerned with on sales tax is the concept of cannibalization, okay? And that generally is, right now the city is capturing whatever its sales tax base is, okay? When you generate new retail opportunities, what you really only want to capture is TIF revenue, if you can. What is the new sales tax that's being brought to the table as a result of that development? I don't want to see sales tax spent over here in Pryor just moved over to here in Pryor, because now I've actually created a net loss to the city because the total dollars coming in hasn't changed any. I've just kind of allocated some to make a project move forward that doesn't really move the overall needle. So one of the things that you're looking at from that standpoint is, you know, what sort of leakage do you have? And I know this is something Ricky talks about all the time. You know, your sales tax dollars that aren't being spent in Pryor that are going to Tulsa or wherever else they're being spent, somewhere outside of the market. When you're trying to capture those dollars, those are the sorts of things that you're really trying to look at. So certain things can be put in place in a TIF district, and they can be as simple or as complicated as somebody wants to make them. On the very simple side, maybe you say, you know what, we're only going to capture half the sales tax revenue, because we know some of it's hard to calculate what the number really is, and it can be ever changing over time, but we're just going to capture half of it because we know some of it's not going to be new. We're comfortable with that number. We'll just capture this portion of it and use it for the project. You can put in place more complicated elements like transfer adjustments. I mean, you don't want to see one of your big sales tax producers move from outside the TIF, inside the TIF, and again, that just creates that big hole there. So one of the things that we might do is, all right, what were they historically locating over here? If they want to build a bigger store that's going to generate more revenue and bring in more retail overall, we want that. We're going to subtract what they've historically been generating at this other location outside the TIF district. And again, we can call that a transfer adjustment generally. And you can go layers and layers deep on that. I mean, I've seen it where, okay, what if another store comes into the old location? Does that offset some of the transfer? Again, we can make it as complicated or as simple as we want to. And kind of talk through the process when we're working on that. There's similar baseline sales tax consideration. So in our downtown redevelopment example, we would talk about what's the historical sales tax base that's been collected across all of the different stores that are down there right now. That's going to be our base. We're going to protect that, and as a result of the project, when we raise that base, improvements, that increment, that's what we're trying to capture from the TIF district. Ad valorem tax, we've talked about the concept of the baseline already. Some of the funding considerations, I'll brush through this. We go into great depth on this when we get into the review committee process, but it's kind of important to note the school district is almost always the biggest recipient of ad valorem. I mean, they're getting 35, 36 mils of general fund levy. They're getting 5 mils of building fund levy, and then they're getting anywhere from 10 to 30 mils of sinking fund levy. And so that often represents 60 to 75% of the total ad valorem tax that's coming in there. And we actually, in the review committee process, we go down and examine, all right, exactly what is the impact of each of these millage levies from all the different taxing jurisdictions so that we can identify exactly how much are they, you choose your word, giving up, investing into the project, foregoing for a period of time. And, and again, if there's an allocation, if we're capturing 100% or 75% or 25%, whatever the number is, how much new revenue are we generating for them by virtue of this project? How much are they foregoing for a period of time? And then when they get to the end of the TIF district, how much new revenue do they have on the table that they didn't have historically? And so we work through all, and there's different implications with all of those, with the school funding formula, such that it is. But I'll be happy to answer any questions on that. But again, that's where we veer off for about 2 hours right there. So I'll jump forward there. Again, the other taxing jurisdictions, they tend to be a little more straightforward. Typically, the county gets 10 mils for its various operations. Whatever the TIF district is picking up, that's essentially what they're going to be foregoing if it were 100% being captured. The challenges of startup TIF financing. Again, the big question. We know these improvements need to be done in order for the project to move forward. Until the project moves forward and gets open, there are no new tax revenues. It's those future tax revenues that are going to pay for the projects that have to be done in step one. How do we get there? So the most common, and I would say the ideal way to proceed is if you've got a developer or development entity that has the ability to pay those costs themselves up front. That's the idea. Whether they buy a bond that's issued by one of the city's public trusts, or if they just pay out cash and they get reimbursed those costs over time. We've done reimbursements with an interest component, so it's I've had some communities say we don't want to issue debt, but we're happy to reimburse them the cost plus interest. I mean, that's in my view, that's kind of the same thing, but it's called something different. But that's ideally. The reason why you'd like to be there is because the developer is the one that really has the most control whether or not the project is successful and whether or not it generates the revenues long term. And so if they're at risk for the incentive, that gives them the incentive to do the project in a way that it's going to generate that revenue stream that's going to benefit them down the road. So that's where you would like to be. That's where we try to get as much as we can. Sometimes that's not feasible. Sometimes there's not a developer that's specifically out there, in which case typically then the ability to finance those projects may fall back on the municipality. And so how do you do that? Well, I mean, you can allocate dollars out of your budget to do these projects, but that requires prioritization of these projects as opposed to other projects in the community. And again, that's a facts and circumstances, whether or not the community feels that's the appropriate allocation of those dollars. The city could go out and they could issue some debt to fund those projects over a period of time. We can fund TIF projects by issuing debt that's secured by TIF revenues. It tends to be a challenge on the front end, especially in more recent times. banks don't like to speculate on things very much anymore. I think they got into some trouble doing that some time back. And so they tend to want to see, they might want to see, guarantees from the developer. They might want to see, what are the financial strengths of the developer, the ability of them to move forward on the project. They might want to see some additional collateralization from the city. Does the city have utility revenues or sales tax revenues or some other revenue stream that it could put behind that as a backstop on that debt in case the project doesn't generate the revenues that it is projected to do so. Again, that becomes a prioritization issue. If you use your debt capacity, and by that I mean the revenue streams that you have available, if you're going to take some of that to secure other debt, that might preclude you from moving forward as quickly on other infrastructure projects that you've got across the community that you might want to do. So again, doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but it's something that you need to kind of take into consideration there. So, so if the city's got the finances or the ability to fund those, that's kind of maybe the second best way to get it done. You can you can find different banks, you can find bond investors. There's an interest rate for every project out there. It may not be a very good one, but there is an interest rate out there. But one of the things that we work really hard with our communities is trying to find what's the most efficient way to do this. You don't want a multi-million-dollar TIF that can only fund a couple $100,000 in projects because it's paying a couple $1 million in interest. That's just not very efficient to that end. So once we get TIF districts established and we've got a proven historical revenue stream, then it becomes much easier to finance it out on the market with banks or bonds or whatever the case may be. So a lot of times we might accept not as great financing terms on the front end, a little bit higher interest rate or whatever the case, but the idea is that once we get it established, it gets going, we've got the ability to go in and refinance it to better terms at that point because, and maybe release some of the additional collateral that we might have had to pledge to get the deal done in that particular instance. So we try and, go out and get more favorable financing terms once we've got that proven revenue stream. Okay. I've talked a bunch at this point, so any questions that you want to ask? The next section is kind of some of the common arguments that we see. So if you haven't read ahead and think you can guess what they are.
You know the saying, I know just enough to be dangerous. I don't even know that I know enough to be dangerous with this. It's not my bailiwick. It seems to me the first thing that, I'm just being real elementary here, is you even have to establish, you talk about this project plan. It seems to me the first step is you have to even develop that plan to see, does that then guide whether or not it's even worth doing a TIF? You're talking about redevelopment. I would imagine what we would be talking about as a city would be just a kind of redevelopment, redoing of the downtown area, and there's even plans being discussed about what that's going to consist of. So, do we have to formulate that first so we know, okay, do we now have something that we can generate revenues with?
Yeah, that would be the right process. The plan would represent what you're trying to accomplish. The plan puts in place the frameworks for capturing that revenue, what sorts of things you're going to try and accomplish, what improvements are you going to use the revenues that you generate to make those improvements. But yes, to answer your question, you want to determine what it is you're trying to accomplish. And then we're going to build a project plan that represents that.
And what the cost of that project is, right?
Yep.
And you say capturing revenue. Is it something, let's say the city, that they're not going to have a developer come in and say, oh, we're gonna redo all this. It's gonna be on the city itself. And you're capturing revenue, do you in such a way that, so you know you have that revenue captured from the future, but you're gonna do the expenses now? You don't recapture or capture that revenue and hold on until you have enough to do something. You're recapturing it for in the future. Does that make sense? Am I asking that right?
Well, I mean, you could do either,
Okay,
but typically
you want results.
Typically, there are improvements that need to move forward in order to spur the additional investment that's going to generate the TIF revenues. You can have a scenario where you're capturing revenues, you know, it's a chicken or egg thing.
Right.
But yeah, typically, you're going to have some expenditure on the front end. But you could certainly start with a phase one, and as revenues start coming in, those can start funding subsequent phases, and maybe, you know, the phase one revenues pay for the phase two projects, and then the phase two revenues reimburse the phase one costs down the road.
And those initial outlay of money is gonna have, if it's the city, it's gonna have to come from the city, from probably other sources, or, I mean, or just to get reimbursed. I mean, you know, if we have rainy day funds or something, it's
Yep.
used for that, and then this is used to reimburse that later.
Yep.
And then you talked about the increment district, you know, establishing a baseline. So let's say we're just talking about the downtown area, we just want to talk about sales tax.
Mhm.
Do you establish a baseline with the sales tax too? I mean,
Yes.
is that established for the whole area? And so the TIF then captures anything that's above that,
Yep.
is that right?
If you're generating, let's say you generate 500,000 in sales tax from that defined geographic area over the course of a year, or that's the historical number. And how do we know that? Well, because somebody at the city has the ability to get with the Oklahoma Tax Commission and pull the individual sales tax permits and see exactly how much revenue is being generated on each location.
That's
and-
correct.
And build
So-
that.
So draw a picture, draw a circle around downtown corridor and be able to capture that knowledge of sales tax revenues that the downtown corridor merchants would generate.
Well, let's say, so however you establish that baseline, let's say it's, for sake of argument, it's $500,000. So we can't tap into that 500,000, if I'm understanding that right. It's anything above that. And so, and you can take a percentage of anything above. You can say, we're gonna take all of that,
Right,
or we're gonna take 50% of it.
correct.
And you hope you're, because of what you're doing, you
Mhm.
hope is increasing this additional sales
Correct.
tax. Now, so how does that work different from a sales tax rebate? What's the difference?
Well, in a sales tax rebate, you would have an agreement with a specific shop owner. And I mean, you know, it might be a pure, you know, one-off agreement where, okay, you're gonna expand your footprint. You're gonna take up the vacant space that's next to you, and by virtue of expanding your footprint by, you know, maybe there's some minimum amount that you have to, the additional sales that you generate above and beyond what you've been generating will rebate some portion of that back to you. So they're gonna incur costs to do improvements or whatever to make that new space viable. And it could be, you know, it could be for a year, it could be for 5 years, it could be for 20 or 25 years. Again, I mean, we're not even talking about a TIF there. I mean, it could be whatever is an appropriate term, and it could be all of the sales tax or some part of it.
Okay, so is that more for use like a one-on-one, as opposed to an entire district? I mean,
Yeah, it would be more effective kind of one-on-one. Now, not to say that if you've got 20 retailers that, I mean, I've seen communities that have made by ordinance a program available that basically codifies as an ordinance that type of incentive. If you expand by this much, or you make this much investment in the facade and the area in front of your store, then that entitles you to, you know, maybe be rebated the costs of making those improvements out of the, you know, it might or might not be tied to how much sales tax they actually generate, but it might just be a, you know, it might be an incentive just almost for like a beautification type project. And that's something that could be done, you know, anybody who does that citywide, or maybe within a defined area downtown gets that.
Or does it work too, if we have vacant buildings that need some work done them to get them back into a usable, you know, state, can it be used for things like that too?
Yeah, it certainly could. So again, if you're outside of the TIF district, now you've got the budgetary considerations of, I can only use certain pots of money for that. And so as it generates sales tax, you know, if you have 4 cents of sales tax, but only 2 of it is available to do that, if you give somebody a 4-cent sales tax, that's all gonna come out of that 2 cents. So it's kind of pulling down everything else, whereas those dedicated sales tax, they're gonna have kind of an influx of dollars because it's not being captured. In a TIF district, we can kind of level that where it just captures all of the new sales tax. So, I mean, one of the things that you think about, I mean, a program like that, you know, kind of by ordinance might work for something like that, especially if they're smaller, more cosmetic improvements. If you've got properties that are vacant that are gonna maybe require more significant capital investment to make them work, a TIF district might make more sense because kind of the concept that, you know, if this building fills up and becomes viable again, and, you know, and it increases foot traffic, it's probably gonna have a positive impact on their neighbors. Their neighbors are gonna benefit because they don't have, you know, a boarded up store next to them, but they're gonna see additional sales tax revenue that's being generated. We capture that all within that whole area, and then we can kind of hit the most critical projects within that geographic area that we need to address.
And to hit those critical projects, say you have the TIF district, you still need the cooperation of the owner of the property, don't you? I mean,
Well, in order to improve a specific parcel of property,
right,
yes, you would need their cooperation, and ostensibly how you get that is you provide some incentive to them in
Right.
the form of this
that's what
development
TIF is
agreement.
doing, is creating that incentive to them.
Yeah, the TIF is going to provide a revenue stream that helps, or it authorizes an expenditure for that purpose. Again, if it comes from somebody else up front and those dollars get recouped, whatever the case may be. But yeah, it provides that mechanism for incentivizing these specific projects. And, you know, again, those are more kind of on the private side improvements as opposed to the water lines and the streets.
Or
But again,
the streets or the sidewalks, or just the beautification of downtown, or access, or public parking, or things like
Absolutely.
that. But if you want to branch out and do the others, at some point, it's going to take their cooperation at some point in time. And those are things I guess you would want to identify. If that's the goal, you'd want to identify those in the project plan first, and probably have people on board before you do that, or?
well, you'd like to gauge the interest. I mean, what some communities have done is they've gone in specific properties like that. You know, maybe they just buy the property and, you know, kind of buy it, and then, you know, you may kind of separately to the process, you may engage realtors or developers to help try and redevelop those properties that now the city owns. You know, it's just kind of a concerted. It's hard to limit this discussion just to TIF districts because there's a lot of other different things that are at play that a TIF can be an important part of it, but is not necessarily the whole of the development project. But yes, I mean, the TIF would be
How
part of that
frequently
process.
do property owners come to the city for assistance? Rather than the city going out and doing the plan and then going out and contacting?
That's a hard question to answer.
Or-
I mean, the answer might be, depending on the community, property owners might come all the time.
So
but-
property owners do come all the time.
Yeah,
I mean, seeking for some kind of incentives, seeking for some kind of assistance.
yeah, I mean, that's true. and, you know, how much, and, you know, what precedent is there within the community to be receptive to those requests. Again, you know, a TIF district would be an appropriate tool when you've got an area that has similar type needs, similar type requests that are coming. It could be part of a program to help impact the larger area as opposed to just a single entity, although there might be multiple individual agreements that ultimately originate out of that to handle the specific projects.
So specifically in Pryor, we have many property owners in our downtown corridor. So we were speaking specifically about downtown corridor. We do have some property owners who may own maybe a little more of the property in the downtown corridor. And as we try to move forward to improve, then like Mr. Sordahl said, starting from an elementary perspective, which is where I have to start because I'm not schooled on these things. But there are a couple of defining words. One of them is district, so we're defining a particular area, and then the increment of financing. So those two words define kind of what we do. So to know what tax generation revenues are produced in our downtown corridor, what sales tax is produced, we can find out that information. We can also identify the area, we can identify the district, and so go step at a time and try to understand if it's something that we could possibly do. But we don't know that until we go investigate.
Yeah,
that.
there's an evaluation process that you go through, and with respect to the properties that are not being utilized or are being underutilized, at some level you have to start making some projections. Okay, if we do these things and we can get someone in there, what's a reasonable expectation for the amount of tax revenue that property might be able to generate? And that's going to be what we estimate to be our tax increment, is that new revenue that's being, you know, some business owners will see, their sales improve, they generate more sales tax. So there'll be a portion of tax there, but then a bigger chunk will be, if you can increase the number of retailers from 10 to 25, and they're all doing business at a reasonable level, now we've generated that additional level that's coming in.
Another way to look at that might be the amount of floor space. Scott, do you have an idea amount of floor space that's not utilized?
There's some pretty good sized buildings right now that are not utilized, probably 10,000. I think there's two buildings that are about 10,000 square feet downtown.
So 20,000 square feet.
Probably more than that.
So if you take the amount of space that is being utilized and say that space is generating this particular amount of sales tax revenue, and then you look at the amount of space that maybe is not, I mean, that's not a perfect scenario, but it is a statistic to look at that would perhaps be a starting point.
And one of the things, I mean, a number of communities have done with that type of downtown redevelopment is there some project within all that, whether the city does it themselves or they can find somebody to partner with that kind of becomes a draw to it, whether it's some sort of entertainment venue or maybe there's a specific retailer or movie theater or something like that would create a draw to an area that you might provide a targeted incentive to that, because the idea, if you can get that in there, that increases the traffic and that will support, other restaurants and other shops that might be down there. And so sometimes that might become the centerpiece of a TIF project, is to try and identify and put in place some sort of draw for the area.
So these projects have been done across our state in various ways and different sizes and that sort of thing. So and you're familiar with some of those, maybe you worked with many of them. So perhaps a 10,000 population community that has a draw in a 30-mile radius of somewhere around 80,000 people. Can you give us any examples of let's say downtown renovation projects that were TIF?
Well, one that we've talked to quite a bit, and ultimately they move forward on it without a TIF. That's what I say. I mean, you don't always have to have a TIF to do this. One that immediately comes to mind, just because we were talking about it the other day with the city manager, is Broken Bow. I mean, they've got a development or kind of a downtown area. They had a lot of dilapidated buildings downtown, and the city's actually gone in and bought a lot of those properties, and they've cleared some of it. They're actually putting in I think it's some sort of like concert pavilion type deal, but then also working with other, people to locate, make it a kind of a restaurant, and I mean, there will be some boutique shops, but primarily restaurants and wine bars. And I mean, if you're familiar with that part of the state, that kind of become a wine area.
Right.
But I know in the case of Elk City was one of the examples from where they actually passed an ordinance just providing an incentive to anybody that wanted to expand their downtown retail footprint. If they took X amount of floor space, that was or percentage over the amount that they were currently operating in, that they would automatically qualify for a rebate of the sales tax that they generated over and above their historical. I think if I remember right, I think they, it was like 100% the first year, and then went like 80, 60, 40, 20 or something like that over a 5-year period. So again, providing incentive to try and
So if you do that with a site that's essentially vacant right now, their historical sales tax is zero.
Right.
So you can give them an incentive, anything above and beyond, I mean, it seems to me that may be a way too of giving the same incentive to an owner of this property to, well, wait a minute, now I can redo this property and I can actually start generating sales tax and get a rebate on that for a while. I mean, and my baseline was zero because it wasn't generating anything.
Right. Yeah, and again, I mean, there's not a requirement for a baseline when you're outside of a TIF district. If you're in a TIF district, you need to establish that baseline formally. If you're not, if you're just doing a rebate agreement, you don't have to, but the city would be wise to take that into consideration because, again, they want to know what is the net financial impact to the city. You want a situation where the result is the city ends up with more sales tax dollars than they had before as a result of the project, as opposed to less.
I think I saw some hands. Jack?
In regard to that, what is the possibility of doing eminent domain in situations where property owners are not want to participate?
So
I think this group, or the city, for sure has the right of eminent domain.
yes, the city does have right of eminent domain. It is generally pretty limited in Oklahoma. You cannot take property specifically for economic development purposes in Oklahoma.
Okay.
If you remember, there was a lot of to-do about, I think it was a Connecticut case, Kelo. The law in Oklahoma is substantially more in favor of the property owner with respect to eminent domain than it is in other parts of the
If
country.
they don't want to participate, you pretty much.
Now, that being said, when you have a situation where an area is designated as blighted, that changes.
Okay.
That changes. Now, whether or not a blight designation is appropriate for an area as opposed to maybe a specific building or something like that, that's something the municipality's got to
It
determine.
would depend on whether the potential development was significant enough to warrant going through those extra steps.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to say while I'm doing this, I found the newspaper articles in Oppenheimer
example, the type of services that your firm provides, is it normally, do people come to you and say, we know what we want to do? Or do you all even assist in developing these project plans?
Yeah, I mean, typically, we're engaged by a city, and typically our engagement for a TIF district would cover all the procedural elements, actually drafting the project plan. In doing that, I'll need to coordinate with the city, whoever, any developers that might be involved, any of the appropriate stakeholders in making appropriate assumptions as far as what sort of revenues we think. I do not proclaim to be an expert in how much store A is going to generate in sales tax from you. I mean, I've got enough anecdotal experience to be dangerous, I guess is a good way to say it, but I'm
You
not.
have enough to be dangerous.
But yeah, that in and of itself is not my area of expertise. But taking that information and synthesizing it into the project plan, yes, that's something that I would typically draft, and then walking through with the committee and the review commission or planning commission and the city through those steps, and then on the back end, then working with the city to help negotiate development agreements or a development agreement template, depending on what might be appropriate for a particular deal. So, yeah, kind of the full range. I mean, I've done, I don't know how many sales tax rebate as just kind of one-off documents. I've done those. I mean, typically something like that, we do that as, just on an hourly rate. Typically, when we do a TIF district itself, we'll usually, typically it's a set fee amount. I mean, I've got a pretty good idea of how much time it takes in any particular instance, and we'll typically work something out where we've got some portion of it that's going to be non-contingent, that's just payable along the way, and then some portion of it maybe that's contingent just from the standpoint. I mean, as bond attorneys, we typically only get paid when we close a deal, so we're kind of used to that. That's not a very good business practice, I don't think. Like unlike engineers who get paid for everything they do along the way, we only get paid at the end when we do the financing. But we usually can kind of share some of that risk with the city in doing that, so that if you get partway into it and you are met with significant unexpected resistance, I mean, we can kind of shut it down and not have quite so much expense related to it. So,
Might say a city does have a good experience with this firm as bond counsel, and they've been very, very helpful to us over the years. And so they're not somebody who is unfamiliar with us, and we are also not unfamiliar with them.
Somebody have, Jack?
There's another, what I understood you to say a while ago, Fred, was if these people are actually involved in the development, and I'm hearing that they're not. They're working with drawing up the paperwork that implements that. But in that regard, if we had an area of town that nobody was particularly interested in developing, we could, you guys, the city could form a TIF district, and I know there are people, I talked to one guy several years ago when I was in real estate, who said, hey, you guys define the area, I'll find the people to occupy those properties. So, that, that's a possibility. But, everybody's got their own area that they work in.
we've done, I'll be honest with you, I mean, we've done that on some TIFs, and it's kind of a mixed bag of success. I mean, I think you want to be wise about identifying just a specific area that you'd like to see develop. I mean, you need more than just, we'd like to see that happen. I mean, it especially in those instances, I think it tends to work better if you can find somebody that can come in, and I know Ricky's got a lot of contacts with respect to that, but when you can find somebody that come in, if you're looking for like a retail center or something like that, somebody that's what they do. I mean, I don't build retail centers. I wish I did, but I don't build retail centers. That's
I'd
not
say
my,
The greatest majority of the TIF districts that I've worked with Nate and his group on are project-driven, to your point.
So you got to develop that project plan first, and then see if the TIF will work.
Yes.
It's kind of like, it's not kind of like if you build it, they will come.
Now, there's some, you know, for example, Broken Arrow. Their roads district was not project-driven, but more, to me, more vision-driven.
Yep.
From the city, itself, wanting to see something. Owasso did something very similar. These are communities obviously larger in population, but who, Owasso for the, you know, for all practical purposes, really didn't have a downtown, area. It was very small and inconspicuous. They wanted to do something that would allow them to create an area where they could draw people into downtown and create and stimulate, investment. And that was done through a TIF district.
and relative to that project, I mean, what specifically was done though is they created a pretty substantial incentive for flight safety to expand their operations there, which is right at the north end of the Rose District. And so that created some market for that area, but then they leveraged what they were gonna generate off of that to do improvements throughout the Rose District to help make that a better. So, I mean, they were able to leverage a specific project that wasn't downtown redevelopment to get the downtown redevelopment piece actually done.
And Mr. Chairman, to the sales tax, rebate scenario, every part of Owasso's sales tax and retail areas were developed with a sales tax rebate as the vehicle, for the, every square foot of it. So there's benefits to both.
Well, and also, I mean, understanding, because what we keep hearing too, you know, we're, you know, the Broken Arrows and the Owassos probably have more funds up front to be able to, that's why you know, Broken Bow and Elk City kind of, you know,
Yeah.
give me a thought of what did they do? Or what we would do with, when we have the limited funds up front, would we be looking at TIF or would we be looking at, the,
Yeah. Well, and
Tax
I mean, in the case of,
rebate?
you know, we did a TIF district out in Elk City that was out an I-40 area. So it wasn't the downtown, they actually just did that by ordinance. And I think they had some success just providing kind of a limited incentive to businesses to open or expand. You know, the project that was out by I-40, that was more developer. There was a specific developer out there that did several projects, and there was supposed to be a Lowe's, and that was one of those Lowe's. Shouldn't say.
It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. I shouldn't say. I shop at Lowe's. I shouldn't say not nice things about them, about their corporate development strategy. But anyways, you know, in the case of Broken Bow, I mean, they actually, from a cash standpoint, I think they're sitting on quite a bit of money. They've historically been very conservative in their spending, and so they've decided to invest some of that specifically in that project. So again, every community is a little bit different what their
right,
position
and
is.
so we gotta see what the fit
Yeah.
is for.
Exactly.
I just want to throw out that you don't necessarily have to have the funds up front. You can obviously use a debt vehicle, and you use the tax increment as the collateral against that debt. That's how you get the funds up front. You're not having to sit and wait until we have some upfront
Oh, I understand, yeah,
to use. Yes. I
And
just want to make sure that.
right, if you can find somebody willing to do
Yeah,
that.
and again, the challenge up front is sometimes that, you know, especially if there's not a specific developer that's kind of the lead of a project, you know, I mean, a bank is not necessarily gonna be willing to lend purely on that speculation that, well, if we do these things, that will cause this development to happen long-term. Now, they're willing to make that loan if the city's willing to say, you know what, we'll put our sales tax behind it, so if the deal doesn't
Or
pan
or
out.
a portion of the sales tax.
Yeah, we're,
And I-
you're still gonna get paid off. We're willing to, we're putting our credit on the line for the project. And again, that comes with, there's a cost to doing that because you can only put your credit out there so many times. So,
Questions, other questions? Anybody else?
You also had, you stopped in your sequence there, and you also had challenges of startup tip financing that we didn't really talk about, or maybe we have talked about those
the,
in your outline.
yeah, I think we've generally talked,
Yeah,
I think we've talked.
I think we've covered.
Talked about most of those, yeah. But I didn't want to leave anything out.
I mean, I think the last couple items there, you're creating an unfair competitive advantage. I mean, I don't necessarily think that's an unfair criticism. I mean, you hear a business that's been there for 30 years and you're putting in a TIF district and putting in an infrastructure that, you know, allows other businesses to go in and they're gonna be competitors. I mean, I think there's some truth to that criticism, but I think you kind of weigh it in respect of all the facts there. You know, you're taking money away that could be used to educate my children. You know, I mean, a TIF district that's properly constructed, it's creating new revenue that wasn't there before and wasn't gonna be there unless the TIF district was put in place. So that's not really true. And in theory, I mean, you enhance that tax base long-term, that generates more revenue that's available for schools and other taxing entities. You know, all the businesses are moving to the TIF, which means we're gonna have to start laying off police and fire personnel. You know, well, again, that's why you put in appropriate constraints to address cannibalization issues and make sure that you're gonna have a net increase in revenue. You know, and perhaps it's a net neutral for a period of time, and then at the end, now it's a jump up, but you wanna structure it so that you protect yourself against that. And then, last thing, you didn't let the people vote. You hear that sometimes. There was actually, I mean, this is part of the state constitution, so it has been voted by the entire state. So as a result, that's the vote. Now, any TIF ordinance that gets passed, it's subject to referendum, just like any other ordinance, and I've seen it happen a couple of times. People filed a petition, and it ultimately went to a vote. And so that's fine. I mean, typically what we do is, you know, we put a TIF in place, and before we, you know, do any financing or execute any development agreements, we let our 30-day time period run to make sure that there's not a challenge on a referendum basis. If a city, now the city could allow the public to vote on it. In order for the city to issue debt, it would require a vote, just like it does for any other debt. But a public trust can issue debt on behalf of the city, and that's just the typical approval of the trust and then the approval of the governing body of the beneficiary.
Right.
Anything else?
What kind of time frame, if, you know where we're at in our consideration process? If this authority and if our beneficiary city and if the property owners come together in a consensus and say, yeah, we think this is something we want to do. This is something we want to do. What is the time frame for the planning and the development process, the document preparation process? What is the time frame for all of that to come together to the point that you got a viable TIF program in place?
From the point in time, I'll kind of work backwards on this, from the point in time that we've got a project plan, this is what we want to do, we've got the document drafted and it's out there, the procedural elements of it are really 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, you've got some notice periods. The review committee is a public body, so it meets by special meeting that's open to the public. You got to give notice, 48 hours notice, and post the agendas and all that. You've got to give 2 weeks notice on the hearings. The the hearings are timed such that, they can't be right on, 2 days in a row. There's gotta be some time in between the hearings, but, so the bigger question is, how long does it take us to get to the point that we're ready to move forward there? The drafting of the project plan itself, once all the facts are known, is not terribly complicated to do. That's something that can get done pretty quickly. It's really just reaching a consensus on what the assumptions should be, what the costs are, likely to be relative to the various projects that are gonna be funded from the TIF district, whatever those might be, or whatever the incentives might be. The estimation of how much revenues are we going to have to work with. When we create a TIF district, it authorizes the expenditures of the funds for those purposes, but it does not mean that those dollars are actually spent at that time. You've still got to have further action taken by the city, in a lot of cases, and the public trust that's helping them administer the TIF district, to actually authorize the expenditure of those dollars, or approve the expenditure of those dollars for a specific component of the project. So, but, standing here today, if everything kind of fell into place really quickly, probably as quick as 4 months or so, if it takes a little longer. And I would encourage, to take some time to be diligent, to really find out what's needed and what's really going to work. I think that'll pay better long-term dividends than trying to just put together something to say, hey, we've got a TIF.
Right.
So, and certainly we'll be happy to help in any way we can along that process.
Anything else, anybody? Mr. Ellis, we certainly appreciate you being here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
for your time.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Next item on the agenda was the Forum of Pryor Main Street Corridor Merchants and Property Owners. I'm not sure why we have,
We've done some of the question and answer, and that was
Right.
part of that.
right, okay. And along those lines, I think what our next, because I know the last meeting we had, we had some property owners come say, well, there's certain things you could do right now. So I think on our next meeting, I'd like to have an agenda item for this trust to have discussion of some of those things and making possible recommendations to the council on some actions that could be taken right now. Also, I think I'd like to see an agenda item to be able for us to look into what we've heard today a little bit further and start that discussion to decide, one, is it something we want to consider? Two, who do we need to get involved and partner with to decide that? So if we can start that discussion with an agenda item next time too, would be my thought. And I'm open to other thoughts and what people are looking for and would like to see for us to have agenda items to be able to discuss and possibly start making some recommendations or things like that. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts. And so more than welcome to hear everybody else's too.
I think we have some good tools at our disposal to be able to follow some of these guidelines and that Mr. Ellis has set forth. So I'll take some initiative with that and communicate with you, Mr. Sordahl.
Right, yeah, if you could kind of generate some agenda and then like let's get together with them before the next meeting and kind of work out those agenda language so we can have those discussions and maybe make some recommendations, not necessarily on this, but like start this, but then also, like I said, what we heard earlier about there's some things possibly we could do right now, so.
Can do.
Anything else, anybody? So I guess we're to economic development updates.
Yes, and I guess just echo what I just said. We do have several tools at our disposal to be able to go forward with the TIF discussion. So the sales tax revenues and what those revenues are, the amount of space that we have, to be able to put that into the formula, to be able to try to make some wise decisions.
And develop even identifying particularly what the project is, you know, even what the plans are for Main Street right now. I'm not sure how those are going to be funded in the future, but this may be an opportunity to create some funding to get some of those things done. Or also look at it from, I'm curious about the sales tax rebate. Is there something there that we could also utilize, maybe a little quicker to maybe also generate some renovation of some of the buildings downtown and some of the ones that are vacant?
Nate, do you help with the ordinances for abatements and this, that, and the other improvements?
What kind of tax rebate?
Yeah, I can, I mean, I can coordinate with Kim on that.
I mean, if it becomes
Well-
something we want to do, I mean, it's also something we could utilize you to, I mean,
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as far as abatements go, yeah, I mean, we can help, we can help with whatever you want. I mean, there may be some things that, I mean, your city attorney can do just as easily either. I mean, we'll be happy to kind of,
well, and that may be, you know, also real, I mean, you know, you can come and talk to me about real estate. You know, I can sit there and read an abstract. I can't do what you're doing. I was a city attorney for a number of years. I was a municipal utility board attorney. I also realized when we got into things like this, I wanted to get the person who knew what they were doing.
yeah, I mean, we'll be happy to do whatever you need.
Okay?
That's all I have.
Okay? Anything else? I think that takes, anybody from out there, anything? Appreciate you again being here. Thank you for getting him here. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
I'll second.
I think that's just all in favor, signify by saying aye.
All right.